Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Legner, and I'm the head of advocacy at Artists for Human Rights. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the launch event of Artists for Human Rights' latest report on prison conditions, titled Shrouded in Secrecy, Prison and Detention Centers in Saudi Arabia. Today's event will be simultaneously translated into Arabic. So if you want to follow the Arabic language channel, you can switch to that on the lower bar on your right where it says interpretation. I will get us started off by offering a few initial comments on the report before engaging a discussion with our 4 expert guest speakers, who will also each share some opening remarks before we will move into a more interactive conversation. The audience is also invited to share any questions or comments. So for that, I kindly ask that you write your name, your affiliation, and the question in the chat box on the lower bar called Q&A. We will collect them and call upon you to introduce yourself and pose your question, or we will read the question on your behalf. I would first like to take a minute to remember Artists' late director and outstanding Emirati human rights defender, Ala Sadiq. Ala died in a tragic car crash on 19th of June, just one day after her 33rd birthday. Ala was a fearless and devoted human rights advocate who tirelessly fought for a better and rights-respecting future for her country and the whole Middle East and North Africa region. Her personality and her work inspired so many people. So together with friends and colleagues, we're working on projects to honor Ala's legacy. Ala was also majorly involved in our prison report. So in order to thank her, we would like to dedicate this report to her. The report, Shrouded in Secrecy, Prison and Detention Centers in Saudi Arabia, comes at a significant time in Saudi Arabia, where we're seeing a worrying trend of increasing human rights violations in terms of arrests and prison conditions. While such violations have been documented for many years, their scope and severity have increased since King Salman came to the throne in 2015, and particularly since he made his son, Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince in 2017. This report is therefore timely in providing information on recent changes in the legal climate and the inherent problems of the prison system in Saudi Arabia. The special and unique feature of this report is a survey that Artists researchers conducted between late 2020 and early 2021 by means of questionnaires and interviews of current and recent prisoners and people close to them. The survey included 16 respondents, and their observations and experiences are featured throughout the report. We have, however, withheld specific details that might potentially identify individuals and compromise their safety. Most, but not all of the prisoners in the survey were male, whereas most of the informants were female, including wives, sisters, and friends. And the prisoners are or were being held in a variety of different prison facilities. The diversity of the survey respondents provides depth and detail to the findings of this report. Our survey also highlights the wide-ranging impact of arbitrary detention and poor prison conditions on detainees' families and friends. The report is structured in 4 sections, namely the legal framework that outlines relevant international and domestic legislation on the treatment of prisoners and to what extent the Saudi authorities do or don't uphold these standards. It is followed by the 2nd section on the Saudi prison system, structure and control, which elaborates on the variety of detention facilities in the kingdom and their administration. Besides general and political prisons, it also talks about juvenile detention facilities and so-called care homes for young women, as well as unofficial places of detention and the increased use of such facilities under Mohammed bin Salman. The third section of the report, called Conditions and Healthcare in Saudi Prisons, sheds light on common problems such as overcrowding, lack of basic hygiene and sanitation, as well as lack of adequate medical treatment, and the spread of infectious diseases, including COVID-19. Section 4 of the report, on torture and other forms of ill treatment, explores the forms of torture inmates are subjected to on a regular basis, as well as incidents that have led to the death of inmates. It also talks about common forms of reprisals against prisoners, especially prisoners of conscience and human rights defenders during detention. All in all, the report identifies an alarming trend of abuse of prisoners' rights. It concludes by offering recommendations to the Saudi authorities as well as the international community. To discuss the key findings of the report, I'm delighted to be joined today by human rights activists, family members of currently detained individuals from Saudi Arabia, and a UN expert. My guests will share their testimonies and findings and hopefully formulate recommendations and more concrete action items that can contribute to the improvement of the situation of individuals deprived of their liberty in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Saudi prison system as a whole. So please welcome with me our guest speakers, who are Hala Dosari, human rights activist, scholar, and trustee at Aqist, Abdallah Al-Oda, Saudi activist and research director for the Gulf at Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, Arish Al-Sadhan, sister of detained Saudi humanitarian worker Abdurrahman Al-Sadhan, and Brian Dooley, senior advisor to the current UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, Mary Lawler. So I would like to start our discussion by welcoming Hala Dosari, who has also contributed to this report as a lead researcher and author. So thank you very much, Hala, for your excellent work. Before I hand over to you, I just want to also make the speakers aware of the fact that the translator needs to simultaneously translate. So please, if you can, also think of the speed in which you're talking and try to slow it down a little. I think that would help. So Hala, given that you have co-authored this report, on that basis, I would like to ask you to elaborate and share with us some key findings of the report and the conclusions we can draw from them. So Hala, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Julia and Al-Qist, for contributing to our understanding of the prison system inside Saudi Arabia. It is one of the most difficult areas to research and to access information. Previously, we had a window basically to information about certain groups of prisoners. It's an online resource that was created by the former Minister of Interior. But unfortunately, since research has been done twice on this online resource, it has become basically inactive now. So we're not able to access the information or to get updated information on the system from outside of Saudi Arabia, or for people even within Saudi Arabia who are not directly involved with the prisoners. So the name of the report, Shrouded in Secrecy, is quite a good fit. Again, the main findings of the report is that there is no independent monitoring or transparency when it comes to the prison system. And the major concern now, since the ascent of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to power, is the increase in or excessive use of imprisonment or detention, torture, neglect of prisoners' rights, in addition to lack of responsiveness of the authorities to claims by prisoners, to claims of torture or claims of ill treatment, either by the prisoners themselves or by their families. So we noted that the authorities rarely respond to any kinds of requests for information or claims of torture, let alone that courts really considers the coerced confession or confessions that which were extracted under torture as admissible in courts. So the lack of due process has been systematic in the Saudi legal system. We don't have any written penal code. There are problematic legislations which really violates the minimum standards of prisoners' rights, such as the counter-terrorism and cybersecurity laws, in which they were used repeatedly to go after people who are not criminals, who would not actually violate the criminal procedure under pretext of maintaining the national security and the reputation of the state and other kind, terms of, or broad terms of no specific legal meaning. We have seen wide scales of arrests and detention for various groups of the Saudi society, including journalists, women rights activists, religious reformers, as Arijana Abdullah will elaborate on afterwards. But the report also marks one of the concerning development in the legal system. I'm not going to go into the different prison facilities inside Saudi Arabia, but broadly they are classified into political prisons and general prisons. The main development which I feel it's really concerning is the establishment of the Presidency of State Security. This is an institution which has an overriding authority to any kinds of other security apparatus in the state, with basically a mandate to detain anyone, interrogate anyone, basically keep anyone in secret detention facilities, which have been increasingly used against political prisoners, and to conduct illegal even interrogation or investigation of any case, as we've seen with the hacking of phones. Of course, in most of those cases, there were forced or coerced confession, and some of those cases were remain actually in prison, in detention, without any kinds of referral to trials or respect for due process, which is even mandated by the domestic laws. Some of those cases were kept in solitary confinements. In almost all of the cases that of political prisoners, during the interrogation periods, they were not allowed to have free access to visitation by families or legal counsel. And that really helps in facilitate a climate of impunity, and of course contributed to the fact that there is a wide use of torture. When we talk about conditions in prisons, one of the problems that has been really reported is the overcrowded prison system. And of course, it contributed to the problem of limited or inadequate access to all kinds of services, whether they were access to personal care items, access to even mats for sleeping, or beds at some point. Another thing is the infectious disease. I'm not going to go into length, but TB and COVID-19 were documented as main concerns. In one instance, the delayed access to timely healthcare caused the death of a prominent human rights activist, Dr. Abdullah Hamid, in prison. And we've also noted in the prisons that there are though the law stipulates that certain chronic, certain patients with chronic conditions or who are terminally ill, they should be awarded, like a humanitarian pardon from the king in most cases. But we've seen that it's not only that these people were not, especially, some of the most prominent political prisoners, Dr. Zuhair Qutbi, for instance, or in the case of the one of the prominent Palestinian figure in Saudi Arabia, both of them have cancer, terminal cancer. They were not allowed to get the adequate treatment, let alone being able to be released because of their conditions. So this is something that we've also reported on in the report. Of course, situation is dire, more for juvenile, care facilities, especially for girls and young women. The problem is, again, as I said, is the system does not allow women, in particular girls who, who were sentenced, for certain duration, to be released without being handed to a guardian, to a male guardian. And this really complicates the problem of women prisoners. Some of them might actually, there is actually articles in the law that says that if the guardian feel that she wasn't punished enough or she wasn't reformed while staying in the care facility, she can remain there indefinitely. So this is one of the main problems actually in the legal system, let alone in the, for the women inmates. There was a case that was reported in which a young woman was kept because she was found away from her home. Basically, she fled her abusive father. So she was kept in a care facility, in a juvenile care facility. She was 20 years old. In that care facility, she was found, hanged. Actually, she killed herself after being in a solitary confinement for 20 days. Now, the domestic laws regulates that if someone is kept for disciplinary action in any kinds of solitary confinement, that person should be checked upon by officials regularly, because they know that it shouldn't exceed first 15 days of disciplinary solitary confinement. And secondly, someone has to check on them regularly. But this young woman has committed suicide in her cell without anyone checking on her. It's only after other inmates have tried to call her without getting any response that she was reported. Now, the care facility said that the camera that monitored, there was like a CCTV system that monitors the inmate, weren't working at the time, weren't working for all those days. And they have complained about it to the social services, but they didn't fix the problem. So there is no accountability even for those actions. Now, this is only one thing, but of course there are other problems reported for the detention facilities for migrant workers or people who are illegally entering Saudi Arabia. Of course, there are excessive problems, mainly in the overcrowd. There were thousands of people housed in places which are very limited in space and in services. Some of them have reported very poor access to not only the medical care, but even food and nutrition and hygienic situation. Some of them have died because of that. So in conclusion, I think the conditions and these conclusions that was laid out by the report have been laid out before by the two human rights organizations operating in Saudi Arabia to limit the use of imprisonment as a way to and think of alternative punishment to make sure that certain regulations are reformed, especially when it comes to the regulation on which crime warrants immediate detention. There's a whole list of more than 25 offenses that calls for immediate detention of people. So this is one of the most important thing, is not to use detention that excessively, especially for non-violent crimes. The other thing is, of course, the conditions in the prisons, and to improve access to legal counsel, visitation, as the main thing, basically to prevent torture and to prevent the conditions that really facilitates those kinds of ill treatment.
Thank you very much, Hala, for providing such a comprehensive overview and unfortunately painting a very grim picture of the reality. Before we maybe come to some of the recommendation of what needs to change for the situation to improve, I would like to move on to our second speaker and to hear some sort of personal testimonies of detainees as well. So now moving to our second speaker, Abdallah Al-Oda, who is a Saudi scholar, an activist and research director for the Gulf at Democracy for the Arab World Now. Abdallah is also the son of prominent Saudi cleric Sheikh Salman Al-Oda, who was arrested in September 2017 and disappeared amidst a wave of arrest of religious figures, journalists, academics, and activists. Salman Al-Oda's whereabouts only became known over 3 months after his disappearance, during which he suffered severe mistreatment. In September 2018, Al-Oda was charged under the anti-terrorism law, and he's currently on trial. The prosecution has called for Al-Oda to be sentenced to death. Abdallah will share with us some of the details of his father's case and give his view on the overarching problems of the Saudi prison system and what we can do to improve the situation. Over to you, Abdallah.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks for organizing this event. So I will only be focusing on the ill treatment and deprivation of sleep and etc. on prison, rather than the lack of due process, although both although both are true in this case. So as you mentioned, Julia, so in 2018, September 4th, the trial started. And before that, when they allowed visits, because he was held incommunicado for several months, he started talking to the family about what happened, and we all knew that he was deprived from sleep for a very long time during the interrogation time, for several days during the span of a few months. He was also deprived from medication until his health deteriorated in January 2018, and he was hospitalized for a few days. He was also handcuffed, chains were put in his feet in prison, just to apply more pressure on him during the interrogation. And it was also preposterous that the interrogation continued even after the trial started for very long time, almost like a year and a half or 2 years after the trial started. So it is also during actually the hearing in November 2020, when the family met my father in court after a very long time, like a year, almost a year or 9 months, incommunicado, total incommunicado, not allowing any phone calls or visits whatsoever during the COVID, under the pretext of COVID measures. He told a lot about also deterioration of health and ill treatment. And he told them that because of the ill treatment, because of the medical negligence, the doctor in prison told him that half of his vision and half of his hearing are lost, and therefore even the family had trouble trying to convey things to him, or to to make him hear what they say, even though the prison authorities now started to make the visit through the glass doors and through the telecom between the two parties. So these all these developments happened because of the ill treatment and medical negligence in jail. He was and throughout his imprisonment from day one, he has been held in solitary confinement. He's a 63-year-old who is held and is still being held in solitary confinement from September 2017, just because of tweets, because of petitions that he called for democratic change in the kingdom, and because of his relationship to other activists, other scholars, and other intellectuals in the kingdom. During the trial, many people have been sentenced, including even those who were involved in the killing of Khashoggi. Within 3 months, they did a quick trial. They exonerated the mastermind of the killing of Khashoggi, Saud al-Qahtani and Ahmed Asiri, and everything was done. But my father, since the trial is dragged on since September 2018, now for more than 3 years. It is preposterous. It is actually going to be 3 years soon. So it is preposterous that they use these procedures just to give legitimacy to their ill treatment and misbehavior.
Thank you very much, Abdallah. And that is indeed a horrific testimony of your father's case, really filled with miscarriage of justice, ill treatment, denial of medical care. I would like to then actually go right over to the third guest, Arish, who can tell us more about the story of her brother. So Arish is the sister of Abdurrahman al-Sadhan, who was arrested at his workplace, the Saudi Red Crescent in Riyadh, in March of 2018. His family was not informed of his whereabouts despite continuous requests and complaints filed. He remained disappeared for almost 2 years when he was able to make his first 1-minute phone call. A year later, in February 2021, he was allowed to make his second phone call, whereby he shared with his family that he would be soon released, facing no charges, according to what the prison authorities had told him. However, in his third call in March of this year, he informed them that his trial would begin the following day. He was tried before the Specialized Criminal Court on charges brought against him related to tweets deriving from 2 satirical Twitter accounts, as well as a forced confession. After a short trial that was marred with violations of fair trial guarantees, Abdurrahman was sentenced to 20 years in prison and another 20 years of travel ban. That was on the 5th of April, 2021. His family has appealed the sentence. So Arish, I would now like to ask you to tell us a bit more about the case of your brother, the violations he was subjected to, and the conditions he faced during his detention.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you. Also, thanks for Al-Qasd for hosting this important event and for launching this really important report. So as you mentioned, my brother have been forcibly disappeared and arbitrarily detained for more than 3 years now, 3 years and roughly 4 months, and during which he was subjected to a brutal torture, psychological torture and physical torture. He was held in secret prison. His health had deteriorated as a result of the mistreatment and the abuse that he was subjected to during his disappearance. And recently, after he basically spoke briefly with my family, after 3 years of being held without any charges, there was a promise that he is going to be released. But soon after, within a week, everything completely changed, and he was rushed into a secret trial where he was presented with a list of vague and basically trumped up charges without even any legal representation. Even a family member tried to attend the hearing, attend the court, basically my father, and he was denied access. And they told him that the hearing is secret and no one is allowed to attend. So there was no lawyer, there was no legal representation, family members were denied access, and basically it was completely held in secret. And from that point, there was several other hearings, about roughly 6 hearings. 3 of them, my father was denied access completely, and 2 of them, my brother didn't have any legal representation. So basically, even when it comes to legal representation, he was appointed a lawyer that was chosen by the government, a court-appointed lawyer. So even we were denied the right to choose our own lawyer, or even allow my brother to speak to us and, choose a lawyer, an independent lawyer. So instead, basically, he was just forced to use a lawyer of their choice. And we were forced as well to use a lawyer of their choice, where, as you know, the legal system is not independent in Saudi Arabia, and lawyers are not free to defend their basically the victims, and instead they end up having to defend the abuser instead of defending the victim. So covering up for the abuses, such as the torture, the mistreatment, the enforced disappearance, and any other mistreatments or violations, human rights violations, their rule becomes more of defending the abuser and the government for these abuses rather than defending the victim who is being abused and who is being mistreated and in our case disappeared for over 3 years. And as you mentioned, the charges against him were all basically related to peaceful expression on Twitter. And the evidence, as they call evidence, was nothing but pages and pages of tweets, peaceful tweets. And as you mentioned, the charges also included basically just the 2 satirical accounts. One was barely used from 2012, and there was only a few tweets on it. And the other one basically was critical of the Saudi regime's repression and human rights violations and defending prisoners of conscience. So as you can see, there is a crackdown, and talking about that, the crackdown is not only against my brother. My brother was detained among many other currently prisoners of conscience just for their peaceful expression on Twitter, mostly because of their expression on Twitter. Others are known activists, or they involved in defending human rights on a wider scale, but majority are just basically either anonymous Twitter activists. Basically, they're just expressing peaceful opinions on Twitter, asking for basic rights that anywhere in the world is acceptable and it's actually encouraged. But in Saudi Arabia, it's not. Anyone who expresses their opinion asks for equal rights, for example, for women's rights, or not having jobs, unemployment issues, equal distribution of wealth, or whatever basic rights that any citizen should have the right to, is not acceptable in Saudi Arabia. So far, my brother is actually being barred again from any communication with us. He was sentenced on April 5th to 20 years of imprisonment, followed by 20 years of travel ban, and was told that he can appeal the sentencing. So this is exactly what happened. The sentencing was appealed, and the appeal was submitted on May 4th. And since then, we haven't heard back about the appeal, and my brother is still barred from any communication. There was multiple tries from my family to contact him, to get to speak to him or visit him, but they were all denied. And we were told, my family were told, that he is not allowed any communication at all, not until the hearings start again. And since basically right now, since April 5, we don't know how my brother is doing. He was rushed completely right after they issued the sentencing. He was rushed outside the court, and he didn't even get a chance to speak to my father, or basically even to the lawyer. So he was rushed outside the court, and he was disappeared from that moment. Again, we have no news of him. The 20 years of sentence, the shock of that, especially after being promised to be released, is a torture by itself. I mean, it was a horrible torture on us. How about a torture for the prisoner himself? Not to mention that he is kept in solitary confinement. His health has been deteriorating. He had 2 at least medical conditions that is going on that he never had before. He was a healthy young man. But right now, obviously, from that just shows the severity of the torture and mistreatment he was subject to during his imprisonment. So as you mentioned earlier, and also the same basically torture and mistreatment, like Dr. Abdullah Al-Aoud have mentioned about his father, the mistreatment of my brother. As you can see, it's systematic. It's not just few people. It is actually systematic. It's being applied to many other prisoners, and it's ongoing. It's actually getting worse. So recently, we've seen lengthy sentences. When my brother got sentenced, there was other detainees who got their sentence got extended, or were also handed lengthy sentences as a way of intimidating people and intimidating anyone who dares to speak up their minds or express their opinions. Not to mention basically the use of the Saudi officials of hacking and different ways of hacking to intimidate people, to violate their privacy, to go after them and basically imprison them even on based on anonymous tweets, not even like they're not even tweeting out there with their, as known people or like known names, just using anonymous Twitter accounts. That would be enough for them to be, detained and thrown in prison for years without any legal protection, without any legal rights. So unfortunately, this is the situation going on right now in Saudi Arabia, and the violations are just continuing to get worse and worse without any accountability.
Thank you very much, Arish. And well, that is a second really shocking testimony. And I think what you said is very relevant, that these are systematic violations. So we're seeing systematic violations of a fair trial, guarantees, but also of torture and ill treatment, and there doesn't seem to be much accountability. I definitely do have more questions towards you and the other speakers, but I think for now everyone's also curious to hear from Brian Dooley, to whom I would like to move as our fourth speaker. Brian is a senior advisor to the current UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. And as a writer and human rights professional, Brian has worked on the protection and promotion of human rights worldwide and in the MENA region for many years. He's also a senior advisor at the Washington, D.C. Based NGO Human Rights First. But today he's speaking to us in his capacity as advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur. Brian, could you share with us a little bit about what your mandate has documented in terms of detention conditions and reprisals human rights defenders have faced in Saudi Arabia, and what your interactions with the Saudi authorities looked like, or what you have demanded of them to improve the human rights situation?
Yes, certainly. Thanks very much, Julia, and thanks very much to Akust for organising this and for inviting this mandate to speak again. And let me also apologise again for not being Mary. She will and wants to come and talk at one of your events. She had already committed to speak at an event right now on Haiti. But thanks very much for inviting us, and thanks very much for producing this report. You know, we're often asked to speak at events in response to a report that somebody's written, and of course, when I do that, I always say this is a really valuable and useful report, even when it isn't. But this really is. I mean, there is very, not just the depth of research and not just the detail, but there's an enormous amount of information in here which the mandate can use. And I have one or two questions around that, which I'll wait to the end of when I'm speaking to ask. The Human Rights Defender mandate, the UN Special Rapporteur, dealing with that, you know, has pretty limited, pretty narrow focus and powers. One of the things that it can do is to officially raise issues and cases with governments. And so since Mary started in May last year, she's sent 7 of these official complaints, called communications. She's either led or joined 7 of those to the Saudi government. They are, of course, all around the issue of human rights defenders, because that's the focus of the mandate, but many of them also address not only the issue of why human rights defenders shouldn't be in prison at all, but also the conditions when they are in prison. So much of what I read in your report is similar to, although in greater depth, much of the information that we generally hear from prisoners, families, and so on. The most recent report that the most recent communication that Mary sent was in May, and it was pretty hefty. It detailed 19 cases of human rights defenders in jail in Saudi, and raised issues around the torture and the other conditions. One of the areas that the mandate is focused on in this year is on human rights defenders in various countries who have been sentenced to very long terms in prison, meaning 10 years or more. And so of those 19 cases which were raised with the Saudi authorities in May, I think 12 of them were of human rights defenders sentenced to very long terms in prison. That communication features Abdurrahman al-Sadhan. Now, the Saudi authorities have responded, as they often do. Many governments just ignore, and sometimes the Saudi government ignores these communications. They're supposed to respond, but there isn't an enforcement mechanism to make them do that. They have responded, but that's been translated now at the UN, and so we hope to be able to read their response pretty soon. Their responses to previous communications around the jailing of human rights defenders follow a fairly standard pattern. They say, you're wrong, these people aren't human rights defenders, they're criminals, and you're wrong about why they've been put in prison. In this sort of parallel universe logic, they just say no one is in prison in Saudi for the expression of their rights or freedoms. And in response to allegations around torture, what they've said before is there are guarantees that people aren't tortured. But nonetheless, when that response, that latest response to a very detailed communication is translated and made public, I'll make sure that I'll send it to you. As I said, the next thematic report by this mandate to be presented at the UN General Assembly in October will be on the general issue of human rights defenders serving long terms in prison or facing trial with charges which could lead to long terms in prison. Not really allowed to go into the detail of what's in that and what's not in that, but I would keep an eye out for that when it is released in October. Part of what happens then is that Mary formally presents it at the session in New York, and states who are mentioned or not mentioned get to respond. And then there is often a fairly robust exchange there, because clearly this mandate accuses states of breaking the law by holding people who they shouldn't in detention and so on. That's really I wanted to say in terms of the explanation of the mandate. In terms of the report, all of us, I'm sure, read all sorts of human rights reports all of the time, and this really was very, very strong, and thank you very much for producing it. What I found most useful was the sort of organogram of the detention facilities in Saudi. It's very unusual to see that level of detail. Not only is it interesting, but it's very useful for us in a practical way. And we don't have to get into this now, but I would be very interested in learning around who has what authority within that system. I mean, clearly the mandate is pushing for the immediate and unconditional release of all human rights defenders in Saudi, and that's what we're going to keep doing. There are other issues, though, sometimes around the welfare of human rights defenders in prison, sometimes fairly, what can seem fairly minor issues, but aren't necessarily. I mean, Hala mentioned, I think, access to mattresses and to hygiene products, and sometimes we can try to make an approach to a government to let human rights defenders, for instance, see a dentist. But what's difficult sometimes in understanding how to make that request is who to ask. Sometimes local prison officials, the local prison governor, has actually a fair amount of discretion there about whether or not to allow a Mickey in or a family in for a humanitarian visit. And I find that can vary, obviously, country to country, but that sort of information would be very useful for us to have. And I ask if we could have a discussion around that, because sometimes asking the central government for things all the time isn't necessarily the best way to make some things happen. Thank you very much for asking us. I hope you'll keep asking us, even though you've been lumbered with me again, and sooner or later, really, Mary will come and speak at one of these things. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, and we're also very happy to have you. And yes, I think what you've said really shows that human rights defenders are also a primary target of the Saudi authorities, and that they constitute a large population within Saudi prisons who are exposed to such violations. So I just want to remind our audience they can also ask questions. So there's a chat function or a Q&A function. So if you have any questions, please write them in there, and you'll be able to speak. In the meantime, I mean, I don't know if Hala, you might want to kind of answer a little bit to the question that Brian raised regarding who is in charge of what exactly within the prison system, sort of the different responsibilities. What I would also be very interested to know, maybe from Arish or Abdallah, is, you know, after you told us about the mistreatment of your relatives in prison, like, have you and your family been able, or your relative in detention been able to file complaints? If so, was that to the prison authority? Was that to the Saudi human rights bodies? Has there been any response? Is there any accountability? Like, does that system work? I'd be very interested to hear from you. But Hala, if you want to go first to respond to Brian, and then maybe we'll take Arish and Abdallah after.
Yes, thank you, Brian, for supporting basically the claims of human rights defenders, and keep on communicating with the Saudi governments and authorities, keep on pressing that they are not criminals. Of course, the Royal Court is responsible for all kinds of prisons now through the Presidency of State Security. The widest waves of arrests that we've seen since King Salman came to power, especially since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came to power in 2017, has been those kinds of waves of arrests ordered by the Presidency of State Security. There is a very similar pattern of people finding small security forces raiding their homes, confiscating their, even plainclothed people. They're not identifying, the people involved. They're raiding their homes, taking all their electronic devices, sometimes filming the search while doing it. They don't present any kinds of court orders or a general prosecution order for summoning the person. They often tell the people, the family, that it will be such a short interrogation and the person would come back or would be returned. But then they receive a phone call the next day, the family saying that this person is detained by Mabahith, which basically is a special police or secret police. Most of the time, they don't have any information on how long. It follows like an initial period of interrogation where torture is being used. If we're talking about human rights defenders or activists or political prisoners. During this interrogation period, so there are attempts to coerce confessions or to basically get forced confessions from people without access to family visits or to counseling, legal counseling. They are allowed phone calls, weekly or monthly phone calls. And in some cases, like Arish mentioned, none of them are allowed in any kinds of calls. It's very arbitrary in nature how long a person would be interrogated. But after the initial period, they are then released into a general prison. There are political prisons in Saudi Arabia that are also operated by the General Directorate or Ministry of Interior. There are wings specific for political prisoners. Usually they are not mixed with other prisoners, but at certain points you will find maybe the previous or former political prisoners being, serving time with in non-political prisons. But we know that there are several political prisons in different areas of Saudi Arabia operated by the general authorities of prisons, but the prisoners there are mainly interrogated and tried in special facilities or different facilities. So the Presidency of State Security, as I've mentioned, controls the secret detention facilities. They are either palaces or apartment building or complex villa building that are housing, certain political prisoners. We have the juvenile care facilities, which are under the social care of, under the care of the, Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development. And as you've mentioned, we have also the variation in services dependent very much on who runs the prison. And we've noted that certain prison wardens and officials do respond to demands and requests and communication, and some of them do not. And there is no other entities that you can resort to. For instance, the two entities that most people resort to are either the National Society for Human Rights or National Commission for Human Rights. Both of them have an authority or a mandate to have offices in different prisons and to conduct field visits and trips to investigate any kinds of claims or the conditions of prisons. They have issued certain reports, and it's listed in the prison report. They've issued very much similar recommendations to the recommendations of the report relating to lack of communication with the authorities, issuing pardoning, basically release by pardon to certain types of individuals, making sure that there is an adequate and timely access to healthcare and personal care facilities. So basically, they are not effective in intervention rather than only in documentation, and sometimes they don't even, respond to claims. So this is the problem, that they don't have the authority to intervene or to bring officials to trials. In fact, in the detention on the cases of women rights activists, female members of the National Commission for Human Rights were actually meeting with the women activists, and they've had written testimonies of what happened to them, with the torture that happened to them. The women also did not only disclose the information on torture to the members of the Human Rights Commission, but also to the court, to judges. But no actions were taken. Basically, no one was held accountable, and this is not only for the women activists. There are over 2,000 cases or claims of torture that were presented to the Saudi court, and none of those cases were investigated. This is also written in the special report on the report of the Special Rapporteur on torture, actually, after visiting Saudi Arabia. There is also the Coalition Forces Detention Center. This was one of the most difficult things to obtain, because we don't have access to people on the ground who were actually imprisoned or placed in those detention facilities in Yemen. But we gathered information from the published sources. Of course, there are certain groups of people, especially people who are suspected to be joining either the Houthis or ISIS. So we know that some of them, based on suspicion, were rounded up in those facilities without any kinds of rule of law. There were reports of torture, of mistreatment, wide reports actually online. And of course, the general prisons, which are under the Ministry of Interior. So this is basically the main structure. As I've mentioned, there is no independent facilities or independent institutions inside Saudi Arabia who can actually act on those conditions or those claims or communication. The best that can done is documentation of those problems, which has been actually done by the National Commission of Human Rights, but nothing more than documentation. Actually, nothing from the court system or from the general prosecution. As I've mentioned, even confessions which were extracted under torture are admissible in courts.
Thank you very much for this information, Hala. And if there are any outstanding clarifications, we'll be happy to answer that maybe also after the event. Just wanted to move on to Abdallah and Arish, because Hala, you mentioned it also. Some of the Saudi women human rights defenders got visits from members of the National Human Rights Commission and testimonies that were later on not really acted upon. So my question again would be, have your family members launched complaints? Have they met with any of the human rights institutions? Has there been any response to you?
Yes. we filed multiple complaints throughout the period of, since September 2017 to the Presidency of State Security. We have been calling them every now and then. Excuse me. And we also filed complaint to the Commission for Human Rights, which is a state apparatus that actually mainly does justify arrest and detention and give some sort of, I think, cover up for torture, like the case of women human rights defenders and many cases, including the Dawish and others. And we also filed complaint to prison authorities. They never took anything seriously, and in many cases, in most of cases actually, they declined even to respond. They never responded. They never took it seriously, and it has been the case since since day one of the arrest.
Yeah, same as Abdullah. We filed different complaints from at least 2 human rights commissions inside Saudi Arabia, the Human Rights Commission and another private human rights agency, and both of them, there wasn't much help. The Human Rights Commission completely ignored us until today. It's still ignoring us. The other private human rights agency have responded within a month, but after the case of Abdurrahman was filed to the United Nations, just to let us know verbally that he is in Al Hire prison. Although during that time we hear different, resources saying that he is in secret detention, others saying he's in Tahban. So there was different reports of torture leaking out from different places. But the Human Rights Commission haven't responded at all and haven't really helped us in any way at all. Beside that, my family have filed different letters and faxes to the presidency of the state security, as well as the Ministry of Interior, and none of them, we haven't got any response at all to any of those letters or faxes. So unfortunately, the family have tried every possible way to reach out to the Saudi officials, to the institutions, without any response at all. Even my brother, when he was detained, they haven't confirmed, the state security haven't confirmed that they have him until a month later. And they basically kept him in basically disappeared completely without even informing us that he is detained. Added to that, also during the court hearings, my brother have mentioned to the judge that he is having difficulty getting any phone calls or visitations approved. And the judge responded that it's because of Corona restrictions. And my brother answered, what about behind a glass or, through headphones? And his request was basically ignored. And the response was from the judge, we will allow only the lawyer to have communication with you. So obviously it is intended to completely isolate him and deprive him from any communication with us. And not to mention also the same 3 judges, surprisingly, are the same 3 judges who sentenced my brother are the same exact 3 who were who charged and who charged the prominent human rights activist Lujain al-Hadul. And that just tells you that the court is not independent at all. All the orders are coming directly from the Saudi officials. So unfortunately, even trying to file complaints, or whether from the detainees themselves, they can't really complain about the abuse that they are facing. If they do, they get retaliated against. And as family members, we don't get any response at all. In our case, we haven't got any response at all. So apparently this is intended to have him kept under, enforced disappearance. And that just proves that the abuse that he's being subjected to is real, and whatever happened as a result of that abuse is severe, and that's why they're trying to keep everything secret. I believe one of the reasons that they don't want us to contact him is they don't want us to know more details of the torture and abuse that he is being subjected to.
Thank you, Arish. And that, really shows, and Abdallah, that shows that there is no accountability for abuses happening in detention, and that there is a clear lack of monitoring and complaints mechanisms, or where they exist, they're absolutely inefficient. And it's also sad to see that the COVID pandemic has been used to ban prisoners from contact with their families instead of being tackled, and instead of maybe like protecting inmates, because we've also, as the report outlines, documented cases in which inmates have contracted COVID because of a lack of security measures inside the detention facilities. I know we're sort of slightly over the hour. I would like, if it's okay for everyone, to continue for 5 more minutes, because I would also like to take a question from the audience. And there is a question from Sabrina Benoui from Reporters Without Borders. So I would pass on the floor to her if she can, if she's still here and would like to address us directly. Then I think she has the possibility now. Sabrina, can you hear us?
Yes, hello, and thank you for this event. So yes, I would like to ask you a question, any panelist actually, about the documentation, because actually in the Middle East desk, we are in Reporters Without Borders. Yes, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm the head of RSF's Middle East desk. So we are following the events in Saudi Arabia regarding journalists, and we are struggling for the documentation like no other country in the area. There is a total lack of transparency. I mean, in the case of Egypt, for example, we know it's an authoritarian regime, and there are arbitrary detentions, but at least there's an active civil society and NGOs on the ground monitoring the trials. So this is how we can get information. But regarding Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, there's no such things. First, because of the lack of transparency I told you about, and then because people on the ground are afraid to talk with us, and we don't want to put them at any risk. So this will be my question actually. I won't ask you about your sources, of course, this is not the point, but at least what are the official sources we can rely on?
Thank you, Sabrina, and I'm happy to pass that on to one of the panelists. I think, Hala, you unmuted yourself if you want to answer that.
Yes, so for the report, we've tried as much as possible to get first-hand accounts from people who were either former prisoners or relatives of existing prisoners. We needed something that is more up to date rather than, dated, basically. So I've developed a survey for the report where people were asked about conditions of arrests, whether the detention followed any kinds of, the due process, the guarantees of due process. Also asked them about their detention condition in terms of access to health, nutrition, exercise, sunlight, basically. Also asked them about the types of interrogation that they were subjected to and whether they've experienced any kinds of or forms of torture and ill treatment. This is all illustrated in the responses of those people were illustrated in the report. So relied on that, and also we've relied on published credible sources that were published by Al-Qist organization. Al-Qist for 2 decades has been documenting all kinds of arbitrary arrests or detention or torture for prisoners or general basically conditions of prisons. So we've relied on that as well. We also relied on other human rights organization sources. For instance, the major report on the migrant Ethiopian workers who were detained in thousands in certain detention facilities. by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So that has been very much like detailed and investigative reports. The Saudi media reports sometimes on conditions, as I've mentioned, the case of Lama, who was found hanged in a juvenile care. So also sources from the Saudi media. But as I've mentioned, it's very difficult to get access, not only because prisoners in general, including the activists, including the families of the activists, they often are summoned, and they were, if they're released, they are forced to sign a non-declaration forms, basically not to mention anything or not to speak to the media, not to speak to the activists about their conditions, of detention, especially torture. And this is why many of them are held incommunicado, and their phone calls are limited to minutes, and without being able to discuss the case with the family, as happened with Dr. Salman Al-Ouda and Abdurrahman Al-Sadhan. The main basically reason why the government is limiting communication and access to representation, legal representation, is basically because there were ill treatment or torture. There is no other points basically. As to some of the understanding, it came from those people who were able actually to share the charges, to share the information and visits. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of convincing. I was very involved in the case of the women's rights activists when they were tortured. There was a lot of fear. They were not only the women, they were the men also who supported the women, or who have actually advocated for women's rights. In the case of Muhammad Al-Rabi'a, he was the only one who didn't get a release or a pardon after so many years. In fact, he was sentenced for many years in prison just recently. Muhammad Al-Rabi'a's family were not able to contact him, but we knew of the horrible torture that he was subjected to. The problem is nobody knew what is happening to him because of the censoring of his phone calls and lack of legal representation and visitation. So it wasn't possible for the family until they met him, after many months, many months from imprisonment, that they learned of his basically starvation. They wouldn't allow him access to food even, in addition to different forms of beating, electrocution, and torture. He told them that, but they weren't able actually to speak out about it because they were afraid that there will be a retaliation. In the cases of the families who actually spoke about those issues, the family themselves, if we talk about Lujain al-Hadloul, for instance, all her family members in Saudi Arabia are placed under travel ban. Her father once wrote a tweet at the beginning of her arrest mentioning that a woman shouldn't be subjected to this horrible torture without anyone from the officials responding. This is not like our own values or our own morals, if you would think of it, Arabic morals. So what happened is that he was summoned immediately for investigation, and he was asked to shut down his social media account. So you get to see this kind of collective punishment and intimidation that really make it difficult for survivors of this kind of abuse to speak out, or for their family actually to speak out, because it's not only the person who's going to be subjected to further abuse, but also the family in general. So those families who come forward and to speak about those issues are actually, we had prison wardens releasing information about the torture of the women activists. And I'm very grateful for those people, for those officials who actually take this kind of huge risk in order to support their fellow citizens. Documentation, you will find many sources in the report. I hope it would be helpful. But also we have to remember the climate of fear and intimidation within Saudi Arabia that makes it very difficult for people to speak out.
Thank you, Hala. And I think I can support that also from the side of Al-Qis, that communication with individuals on the ground in Saudi has increasingly become difficult since 2015-16 out of fear of reprisals. And I think the recent NSO leaks is just another confirmation. People in Saudi knew for a long time that their communication was surveyed if they were family members of sort of high target political prisoners. Before we close, because I know we're really running late now, and I'm sorry to keep you, Brian had to leave already, but to those panelists that are still with us, maybe just as concluding remarks, what do you think, or in your opinion, what would need to change for the situation to improve? Do you have some kind of an appeal? Do you have a recommendation, a suggestion? I don't know who wants to go first, but please go ahead. Maybe Abdallah, because I think he's also on the run.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, I think what need to be changed is the regime. No, I mean, I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. So anyway, yeah, no, I think what needs to be changed is, I mean, as we notice here, is a systematic approach of torture. So when we say systematic approach of torture and ill treatment, it's also a systematic approach of ignoring complaints about human rights. It is a systematic approach of legitimating abuses of human rights and violations of human rights. So we see here it is all systematic, and when we say systematic, then any change to lower level officials, for example, or to lower mechanism, it's just a change of faces, a change of names, a change of offices. We have seen how the Hala also explained in the report and during this event how the general interrogation, المباحث العامة, or the secret police, was incorporated into the Presidency of State Security since 2017, and this did not change how the المباحث العامة, or the secret police behaved, but rather gave it more legitimacy to work under the umbrella of the royal court and to make more abuses, actually. And we have seen in the last 3 years an increasing pattern of abusive behavior, torture, that we have never seen in the history of Saudi Arabia, I think. So this is all deteriorating, and what needs to be changed to the main question is a systematic reform, rather than a reform to one apparatus, one office, or one person, or one name. And with this, we mean a mechanism where we can supervise the government rather than giving it all the legitimacy of how to deal with its own citizens.
Yeah, I can add to that as well. I think what we could do in the meantime is to continue speaking up, especially everyone who is living outside the country, international communities, human rights organizations, and governments. And most of the time, especially for governments, if there is no people speaking up about these issues, they'll be just forgotten, and the human rights abuses will continue happening behind closed doors. So our voices are very important, and also because we need to amplify the voices of the people inside the country who are risking their lives to even just basically report the abuses they are facing. So, for example, this report is very, very important because it lists very important details about the abuses that are happening, and it's only the tip of the iceberg. I'm afraid to say that the level, this just shows you that the level of abuses are way much more than just what we have right now, because of the secrecy and because of the level of fear that it's being enforced on people. So what we can do is keep up and keep speaking as much as we can. We need the international community to keep the pressure. We need world governments to actually stand up instead of just warming up with the Saudi regime and pretending like nothing happened and going back to business. This is totally wrong, and it's just gonna amplify more and more. And the risk is not only on Saudi citizens. Unfortunately, this also, human rights, everyone's rights. It doesn't have nationality, but the risk is also going to affect people internationally. And that's why it is very important that government should take a stand and should basically condemn those human rights abuses, take action, not just by word of mouth, but also take action. Businesses have to take, a responsibility as well. And, they should check human rights abuses before they can go into deals with Saudi Arabia. Sport washing have to be called out. Any form of cover-up of human rights abuses have to be called out. I believe this is the basic thing we could do right now. At least to, as much as possible to basically condemn these human rights abuses.
Thank you, Arish. Hala, do you also want to add something?
Well, I think the report do have certain recommendations for the international community, certain recommendations for the Saudi officials and for the people of Saudi Arabia. And I can't agree more with what Arish and Abdullah has mentioned, that it's really important to keep on voicing out and amplify the voices of people, finding ways to reach out to people inside Saudi Arabia that are safe. And of course, the changing the behavior of the regime, the constant interferences of the political system into the legal system, very much like closing off of any space for people to engage with the system to reform must actually be taken seriously. Yes, I don't see any way of doing that from within Saudi Arabia, not under the current regime. The only way is for the international community to apply more pressure, to demand more. And I think this is really an opportunistic time for the international community to act on these issues. First, because of the need for Saudi Arabia to to open up. Basically, we've seen how much Saudi Arabia has actually put an effort to bring the international, performers, to bring athletes, basically leading athletes from all over the world. The Formula One, for instance, the Grand Prix, whatever kinds of events. World leaders in civil society, world business community as well to Saudi Arabia, and for investors to come to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia really is acting hard to be integrated into a global system, into a global community. And it is a time where the global community should recognize the responsibility, not only for the Saudi people, but to be able to engage in collective work with Saudi Arabia in ways that will strengthen the peace and security, for instance, and even the business community. I don't think after the Ritz-Carlton and the lack of transparency of rounding up the main business tycoons inside Saudi Arabia, investigating them in a complete absence of the rule of law. Some of them remain imprisoned, some of them were released, but some of them remain imprisoned. This will definitely not send any kinds of assurance to the international community of business leaders that this is a system that you can find legal protection in cases of disputes. So this is a main concern for investors, should be a main concern for investors, and they should demand more from the Saudi government. Also for the civil society, the other governments in the region, the hacking attempts that happened to, for instance, other presidents or Jeff Bezos or other people, just shows the outreach of the regime and the lack of any kinds of pretense that there is a respect for international law or the rule of law. So this is something that should send basically, I would say, a message, a strong warning to the world that this is not a regime that is safe to engage with. And no one knows what is being used, what kind of information is being used and how. So this is something that is that needs, the collaboration of several groups in the international community. And I don't think that there is a way to reform from within, except by creating this kind of safe channels for people to, engage with activist approach or human rights organizations approach, so that they can send their, claims for justice, basically.
Thank you very much, Hala, Arish, and Abdallah, for your recommendations and demands. They have been heard, and on that note, they will also be heard once after this event. We'll be sharing the recording on our Al-Qist Twitter account, and the report, Shrouded in Secrecy, Prison and Detention Centers, will be made available on our website. On that note, I would like to say thank you so much to our panelists for your testimonies, findings, and sharing your stories. And thank you very much to all the participants as well. And should you have any further queries regarding the report, we're always available at contact@alqist.com. And yeah, so thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, Julia, and everyone.
Thank you. Bye.